6 after 7 o'clock. Welcome back to Good Morning TNT for today, Thursday. Thank you for joining us. Let's just give a big shout out this morning to our women's warriors who received their checks from the Prime Minister yesterday, and of course in camp, training hard to make us all proud, or continue to make us proud this coming Tuesday. Don't forget that match takes place at 6 in the evening at the National Stadium. Go get your tickets. Let's show our support, red, white, and black, all the way for these young women who have done us proud, and certainly, in my opinion, and many of our opinions, will be taking us to Canada on this historic trip to the first berth at the Women's World Cup in Canada next year. So we're looking forward to great stuff from that. Still in the U.S., it's Thanksgiving Day, but not for everyone in the U.S. There's some quite a bit of unrest following the grand jury's decision not to indict police officer Darren Wilson in the death of teenager Michael Brown. Our guest to go through the legal implication of this grand jury decision is Attorney at Law Martin George. Mr. George, good morning.
Hi,
Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Nicole, and good morning, Trinidad and Tobago, and happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to you. I always like the idea of a Thanksgiving Day.
Yes,
philosophically.
Yes.
Let's talk about this case. It's not the first case that has pitted ethnic groupings against each other. No. We saw Trayvon Martin with George Zimmerman, but this case has really ignited a firestorm in terms of the expectation, I guess, of the family of Michael Brown and by extension the black community in the U.S. and the white police officer, sorry to put it that bluntly, that pulled the trigger, and his subsequent statements in an interview with ABC News that says his conscience was clear. I think we have a technical issue with your mic, but just to put some context to those who may not have been following the case, the young man was shot and killed, and the U.S. grand jury was deliberating for several weeks, if not months, on whether or not to indict the police officer and put him to stand trial. It didn't turn out that way. Riots broke out earlier this week in Ferguson, Missouri. It spread to other parts. Even this morning, I'm looking at CNN, and we're seeing in Washington, D.C. and other areas, the contagion effect is on. Let's in terms of comparison to our legal system, what's the grand jury?
All right. The way the grand jury system works is that you have a decision being made that you put the case before 16 to 23 persons who comprise the grand jury. Now, the difference is that these are not normal jurors. These are not persons who you would normally screen in the usual way as a jury would, or they're not persons that you give legal guidance, even, in coming to their decision. They are not also persons who necessarily have to be reflective of the community which they come from. So in other words, if you look at how you had the jury selection process, say for instance in the OJ trial, the Trayvon Martin matter, you had scenarios where persons were, chosen to reflect the makeup of the community. That's not the process with the grand jury. The grand jury system comes under the Fifth Amendment, whereby it's enacted that, look, you have this process whereby before you decide to indict someone, you basically put them before a jury of their peers, so to speak, to determine whether the prosecution is either malicious or whether it's baseless or whether there is really some genuine reason for going forward. Now, the test that is applied is probable cause. So the prosecutor will lay out his case and say, look, these are the circumstances, and we are saying that, look, there is probable cause that a criminal act occurred, and therefore we're asking you to confer an indictment against this person. Once they do that, then you'd have it go into the process of a trial. So there are some fundamental differences which occur here. The grand jury system doesn't follow all the stringent requirements of a jury trial. There's no judge present. And the interesting thing about it, and this is something that we ought to bear in mind to sort of balance the scales, Paul. In the grand jury system, the defendant, so to speak, does not have the right of counsel. So he doesn't get the opportunity to say, look, I am bringing my attorney to rebut or to, argue or challenge. No, he doesn't have that right. He doesn't have the right to cross-examine. So the rights which would normally be protected under the Sixth Amendment, those rights are not afforded you, the defendant, in the grand jury process. So basically, the prosecutor has the highest and best opportunity to obtain an indictment. So I think we really need to look at that. In other words, if in those circumstances, if it is that the prosecutor did a good job, presented all the evidence for an indictment, if a grand jury returned a decision saying no indictment, then you really have to look at it. Because when you look at it comparatively, Paul, over the history of the United States, generally prosecutors, once they present their case before a grand jury, they have a more than 50% success rate of getting an indictment. So if in this case they did not, one has to wonder what was the evidence that the grand jury heard, or what may have been the factors which may have swayed them to say no indictment in this case. Because the threshold and the standard they use is not proof beyond reasonable doubt. It's just whether there's probable cause. So that grand jury, if they understood their task and their duty and the remit of their, the circumstances, they ought to have made a finding that, look, there was no probable cause of the commission of a criminal offense.
Given the fact that there's no probable cause, there's no indictment, what recourse is there for the family of Michael Brown? Can we now go
in the same way as in the O.J. matter, O.J. Simpson matter, you recall when O.J. was freed of the criminal charge, the family, they were able to bring a civil suit against O.J. and successfully did so. And the jury in that case made an award of $33 million US, in favor of the family. So there is that option that the family can bring a civil suit. There's also the option that the police department can bring their own internal charges against the officer, Darren Wilson, for, breaches of their procedures or, so there's that option. There's also a final option whereby there can be a federal investigation whereby the Justice Department can say, look, notwithstanding the fact that a grand jury has come back with a finding that there's no probable cause, a federal investigation can be launched, and based on that, if they find that there's sufficient evidence, they can then lay charges from the Justice Department. But the history has shown that once the grand jury returns a finding of no indictment, it's very unlikely, unless there are some peculiar circumstances arising, for the Justice Department to get involved to have a federal investigation.
Officer Darren Wilson said, as part of his testimony before the grand jury, that he was fearful for his life. And that was the mitigating circumstance. He also referenced his police training that kicked in under those circumstances as part of his defense as to why the events unfolded as they were. Are those substantial contributions that can justify that killing in that circumstance? There's some who suggested in a counter-argument that, well, he could have turned away and walked away. He had all the power, he had the firearm, the young man did not. Yes. And so he engaged the young man, and there are those two perspectives clashing. Yeah,
there's much merit to that argument, Paul. And there is a tendency, when you look at the statistics, for the U.S. police officers generally to be trigger happy. You had 2 days ago the shooting of the 12-year-old, with a toy gun. He had a toy gun, and the police officer. In other words, it appears that their modus operandi generally is shoot first, ask the question.
But that 12-year-old case is different because there was a weapon. He had no way of knowing if it was actually a weapon.
Yes, but even when you look at the video, you still wonder, as you say, are there alternatives that could have been used? And that's the question here. And then again, more glaringly in the case of Michael Brown, because if you had a scenario where the officer could have put some distance between himself and Brown, how does it reach to a scenario where you are saying that he is able to make a grab for your gun? Where's the evidence to show, was there any evidence of his fingerprints on the weapon? Because if you realize what came out in the grand jury hearing is that there were no fingerprint swabs taken of his weapon to show any print from Michael Brown. There was no testing of the blood. In fact, the officer gave evidence that, look, I was able to wash off the blood off my hands, wash off the blood off the weapon, that kind of thing. The photographic evidence was poor because when you look at it, most of the relevant things that they should have taken photographs of,
measurement.
They didn't do that. Yeah. one of the forensic investigators said her camera battery died. I mean, really?
Camera battery died.
Really? You know, so I think there are lots of questions, and I think the family would certainly be able to press a good case in terms of a civil suit in the matter, you know, because when you look at it in the circumstances, did the officer do all that was reasonable in the circumstances to avoid a fatal encounter? And I think that's where the test really lies. In other words, yes, I am armed as a police officer. Yes, I have that power. But is it that in every circumstance, I can simply say, well, I felt threatened, so I, you know, when, as you said, if you made that distance, you step back, you said, hey, listen, you stand your ground, why then is the need for the use of the firearm?
Of course, we've seen from the footage in terms of the protests and the riots, and generally the cry is foul, cover up. This so-called white policeman, this white cop, Darren Wilson, wanted to kill someone. And this is what I saw, I think, on a CNN interview. It's not that he wanted to kill Michael Brown, but as you said, very trigger happy.
Yes.
Maybe came out angry that day, or something probably happened at home, or many things may trigger it off. But we're seeing that line drawn down the middle. Minority America, white America.
All right. And Nicole, on that note, I'll tell you, I think that the civil rights leaders, the black American leaders, I think they have misled and misguided the black American public for far too long. They need to change the conversation. Really, at this stage in 2014, you still, with all the numbers you have in the US, you know, demographically and in terms of the population, you are still a minority. Why are you still a minority? Is it because you have not made full use of the opportunities that you can avail yourself of in the US? You look at the Jews, for instance, numerically, they probably comprise the smallest group, but nobody calls them a minority because they have established themselves economically, politically, and influentially throughout the society. So I think we need to start changing the conversation.
I will disagree with that. That's a I'm going to stop you there.
No, you will disagree. You wouldn't stop me.
I'll disagree because comparing the journey of the Jews, the Jewish people, I should say, yes, and African Americans who came through a different process, and or Hispanic people, to me is a misnomer in terms of comparison.
It's not, Paul. I'll tell you why.
And relating it,
no,
and
Paul,
relating it,
not.
And relating it to a
apologists.
Let me finish. And relating it,
apologists
and
have
relating
the people. Cornel West was on the television yesterday, professor of Princeton, you know, and he's basically making apologies and saying, well, you know, people of color and people. And Paul, I am saying for too long we have accepted these excuses. You have every opportunity available to you in the US as a person of color,
How
a black
are you
person.
justifiably
Why
linking
are you not making
the
use
shooting
of the
death of a young black man at the hands of a police officer who, in many people's estimations, is not justified in killing the young man, or other cases of so-called, whether you classify it as minority or not, with some sort of race issue, as is the argument in the US?
No, I'm not justifying the killing. Nicole asked a question about minority versus majority, and that's where I said they need to change the conversation. So separate and apart from the killing.
That is based on the fact that statistically, a black man is much more likely to be pulled over, stopped, searched, and arrested, or accosted by a police officer.
I am saying that part of that change process has to come about mentally, Paul. We need to change our approach. The civil rights leaders, in other words, if there isn't this idea of us being a minority and us fighting a struggle, the civil rights leaders have no work to do. So in other words, they have deliberately kept the conversation that way, instead of looking at areas of saying, well, look, let's aim for education, empowerment. In other words, the early civil rights leaders, they had it correct. No, that's what I'm saying. The early civil rights leaders, that's why I'm always very careful, they had it correct. They did their part and they were very much on the right track. I'm saying now, you look at this scenario, basically persons like Al Sharpton, they're just coming there as volunteers. Reverend Jesse Jackson, he used to do the same thing until he was exposed for his financial dealings.
Those are personal opinions.
They would come in basically to piggyback on the scenario, and what they are good at, they're rabble-rousers. They're able to stir up the crowd and say, yes, let's march and protest. That's great.
But that doesn't mean that statistically
Paul,
African Americans are a minority in the US, and they have certain challenges because of that.
Paul, the point is, numerically, if you look at it, they really ought not to be considered a minority. Opportunity-wise, they ought not to be considered a minority. The ability to progress. When you think of somebody like Robert Johnson, the former owner of Black Entertainment Television, he was the first black billionaire in the U.S. And he was able to leverage his skill, his business savvy, to be able to build himself. You look at somebody like Oprah Winfrey, who has been able to do that. You look at Michael Jordan.
Those are anomalies in a system where there are systematic challenges to the average black youth in moving on. I'm not saying there aren't opportunities, but there are challenges that we cannot just dismiss as not.
I don't buy the apologist message.
I'm not being apologist. I'm being pretty practical.
You have actually the opposite. You've had affirmative action whereby I am actually giving reverse discrimination. I'm giving you a chance ahead of others who may be
So what are you saying, that black Americans have nobody but themselves to blame for the position they find themselves in?
In many ways. That's my position.
That's
my bottom line position.
I want to jump in
here. I say that unreservedly, they have themselves to blame in many ways. Not in everything. There are still systematic ways that they are discriminated against, but I'm saying that largely their mindset and their thought processes. You look at the average West Indian.
I think that's a very dangerous generalization.
No, listen to me. You look at the average black West Indian who may be able to go to the U.S. and actually do better than the local black Americans. Their mindset is their biggest problem. I make no apologies for saying that. They need to change their thinking.
Dangerous and unfortunate generalization.
Yes, Nicole.
Now, the thing about it is that you say that they need to change their thinking, but it trickles down into West Indian society. And of course, this is a topic that has been debated. Oh, Michael Brown has been shot simply because he was black. Now, what would have happened if Michael Brown was Caucasian and perhaps the police officer was African American? In terms of changing the mindset and the mentality, Michael Brown was, we may deem in Trinidad, a petty thief or a petty bandit. That's what's been said. But how do we now change that mindset that, okay, fine, education and empowerment, use that to come out of the so-called minority? Where do we draw the line there?
Well, this is what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying the leaders have that responsibility, and they have, by and large, in the recent years, not discharged that responsibility. You look back to the 60s, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, these guys, they had a very clear and direct message, their reason, their purpose, fully justified. I'm saying now, you look around, who are the responsible black leaders in the U.S. who are really giving that forward thinking? How many young black Americans know about Aliko Dangote? You ask them, who is Aliko Dangote? They don't have a clue. Aliko Dangote is the richest black man in the world. He has a net worth of 25 billion US dollars. They don't have a clue who that is. So in other words, they don't understand the power which lies within them, and that's my point, Paul.
That's a function of an inadequate and unequal education system.
No, it's not. In fact, the only inequality that really exists in the U.S. education system is that you've had many cases where you've had persons favored and given opportunities, and they have not taken advantage of it. And I make no apologies for saying so.
There's a question.
We need, in other words, to lift ourselves, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and stop blaming others for the circumstances.
There's a very profound question that's been asked during this entire case, and is that, would Darrell Brown have even considered Darrell Wilson, considered Michael Brown a person of interest if he were white?
I agree with you, and I think the answer to that is no. So I don't accept, when he was on the interview yesterday and he was saying that, because the interviewer asked that very question.
That alone is precedent to suggest that he was targeted because of his color. And that is statistically what happens every day in cities around the U.S.
Well, yes, we are in violent agreement.
Violent agreement.
We are agreeing on that point, and I'm saying in that case, it's wrong. But what I'm saying, bigger picture, the Afro-American needs to step back, look at himself, and ask himself, have I made full use of all the opportunities that have been made available to me to make me change my status from being considered a minority where I will be targeted to being a majority, whether economically,
I understand what you're
politically,
saying,
or influential.
I understand what you're saying, but it's very difficult for me to sit and agree with that because I don't walk in their shoes. And I have been to the US for limited periods where, as a black person, I have been accosted, discriminated against, and this is for 2-3 weeks. Imagine someone being born into that. Imagine someone living that every day.
Paul, I understand you, and what I'm saying is that that institutional prejudice and institutional racism is a problem, but separate and apart from that, you see, if we aim for empowerment, and I'm talking about true and genuine and lasting empowerment, then these issues become much less significant, because once you have that power and authority, first of all, the respect level goes up, the question of, immediately targeting you goes down, and it's a long-term solution.
I'm all for empowerment, but you also still trying to negate the fact that there is a movement by some to oppress, or to continue oppression, or to continue subjugation. Not because I want to empower myself doesn't mean there's going to be pushback. Yeah, but there is pushback.
Yeah, but Paul, the point is, listen, we need to understand that's the nature of human beings all over, If you look at Rwanda, it was black people oppressing black people, killing them, murdering them for no other reason because you are from a different black tribe than me and my black tribe. So let's understand it. Let's put it into context, because you see, I don't ever want to use that as an excuse for me not achieving my fullest potential. That's all I'm saying. So let's separate the two. In other words, yes, there is still the institutionalized racism and discrimination, which must be dealt with. And I think Cornel West was very unfair on President Obama yesterday when he said that, it's the end of the Obama era, yes, and President Obama has failed. The point is, if you are a true student of politics, art, history, literature, and you look at things in context, you'd recognize that you ought not to have had any expectations of President Obama in the first place. In other words, the pinnacle of his achievement was getting into the White House. After that, it's all downhill. And what else do you expect? How can he, as one person, change a system which has over the years been built up in a certain way? How can he change it for persons who don't even wish to avail themselves of the opportunities that may be presented to them? So you can't say that President Obama is a failure because you ought not to have had those expectations of him in the first place. He did the best he could by reaching there. What else did you really expect of him? So Cornel West, I think, is totally misguided when he said that, it's the end of the Obama era. The Obama era ended the day he was elected in 2008. In other words, once he got there and we felt that pride, that emotion, that was it. In other words, he has done his part. There are others who now need to step forward and play that role. Oprah Winfrey does a wonderful job in terms of trying to lift the thinking and consciousness of people, to empower them, to make them understand that, look, hey, you don't blame circumstances. Look at Oprah's past. Look at what she struggled with.
Not everyone's journey is the same, and not everyone's challenges are the same.
I agree with you.
And
but
Oprah
the point
is an anomaly in a system where it's institutionalized discrimination very often against minorities.
I agree, but Paul, the point is, I would not sit back and complain against the system
and do nothing.
I am not saying sit back and complain and do nothing, but we also have to factor in the challenges that are faced on a daily basis. Great conversation as usual.
As always.
We'll agree to disagree. Mark and George, thanks for being with us. We'll take a short break and come back with me. This is Good Morning TNT.